Alright, this is our video lecture discussing the cardiovascular system. So when we look at the cardiovascular system, the reason it's called cardio is we're looking at the heart, and vascular is looking at the blood vessels. So when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we're talking about the pump, which is the heart, and the transport of the blood from the heart through the blood vessels. So the key functions of the cardiovascular system is to distribute oxygenated blood and nutrients throughout the body and to pick up used materials, wastes from the body, excuse me, and deliver them to the kidneys to be excreted as urine or to the lungs to be exhaled as carbon dioxide. So when we look at the flow of blood, we can see the different vessels and how they're connected. So blood is pumped away from the heart via arteries. So you can always remember arteries away from the heart. So they carry blood, freshly oxygenated blood, except for the pulmonary artery, which carries blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. But in general, you can think of arteries as carrying oxygenated blood from the heart to these smaller vessels called arterioles. So arterioles are just branches of arteries leading to capillaries. And capillaries are leaky, and that's where the exchange with our tissues occurs. So oxygen and nutrients leave the capillaries to feed the tissues and keep the tissues alive. And then wastes are picked up, carbon dioxide and wastes from cells are picked up and delivered to the capillary to be taken to the smaller veins, which we call venules, which branch into larger veins, and that leads back to the heart. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood to the heart, and capillaries are the sites for exchange. So that's the key concept. Are these capillaries is where the exchange takes place. So if we look at blood vessels, they all have an internal space, which we call the lumen. So that's where we find the blood. It's the internal area. And then the endothelium is the lining, the inner lining of our blood vessels. And that is made up of simple squamous epithelium. It's a single layer of cells. And in capillaries, that's the only layer that exists. So that's a very thin wall for capillaries, and that allows for that exchange with the tissues to take place. So if we look at the different blood vessels, we can see that a vein has a very large lumen, so it's able to hold a lot of blood, where an artery has a smaller lumen, but it has a very thick muscular wall because it's taking blood under pressure and making sure that blood can get to our tissues. So we can see this artery is leading away from the heart, going to the capillary bed here, and those, again, vessels have to have a muscular wall to pump that blood to the capillary bed under pressure. Where the veins, you can see again, has a larger lumen, they're receiving that blood, and the way their blood returns is a little bit different. If we look at the internal lumen of a vein, we'll see that there are valves which prevent backflow. So as blood moves up the veins to the heart, there's valves to prevent it from going back downward. We do not see valves in arteries because arteries have that thick muscular wall, which makes for a forward flow from the arteries to the tissues. And again, capillaries are just one thin layer of cells, so we have easy exchange of nutrients and gases from capillaries to the tissue cells. Here's a cross-section of a vein and an artery seen under a microscope. You can see the smaller lumen of the artery, but you can see that thick muscular wall shown in purple here. If you compare that to a vein, much larger lumen, a lot more room for blood, but again, a thinner muscular wall. So if we look at the layers of an artery, the inner layer is that thin, simple squamous layer, but then the middle layer has this smooth muscle which allows the artery to contract and push blood, and that's what determines our blood pressure. And then the outer layer, is just connective tissue that keeps the artery intact. So when you take your pulse, you can take it at your wrist on the thumb side. So go ahead and put your first two fingers, your index and middle finger, on the thumb side of your wrist, and you should be able to feel a pulse if you don't press too hard. And that's a pressure wave that's created by your heart pushing blood through your arteries in a pulsile fashion. So the contraction and expansion of those arteries with the heartbeat is what creates the pulse. So if we can't get a good pulse down at the wrist because maybe the heart is too weak or the vessels are stiff, full of plaque from a lifelong cholesterol issue, then we want to feel for the pulse in the neck. And if you go to where your voice box is, go to the right or left of where your voice box is located, press your 2 fingers there, you should be able to feel a pulse there. That's called a carotid pulse because it's along the carotid artery where you're feeling that pressure wave. So again, if we look at what happens to arteries over time, if people have high-fat diets and they have a tendency for plaque development, we can see with a nice open lumen here. Here's one that's been occluded with a plaque. So this is cholesterol and fragments of cells that collect over time, and it really narrows the flow of blood. So people get that chest pain if this is a coronary artery because there's not sufficient oxygen supplying the muscles, the heart muscle cells. And here's one that's been completely blocked, and that's what will lead to a heart attack or a stroke. If it's an artery feeding the brain tissue, a cerebral artery, we call that a stroke. If it's a coronary artery that's completely blocked, we call that a heart attack. And depending on the size of that artery and what tissue cells that artery serves, we see different results of these heart attacks and strokes. So there's some terms. Vasoconstriction means when there's contraction of the smooth muscle in the artery and the artery becomes more narrow. There's less blood flow. And that would happen if you had really low blood pressure, for example, or after standing up quickly. It takes a little bit for your blood vessels to respond and constrict, and then you might feel some dizziness until that vasoconstriction occurs in your carotid arteries feeding your brain. And vasodilation is when blood vessels open up, and that allows increased blood flow. So these are all important functions that occur to make sure our tissue needs are being met, and these happen reflexively to make sure that we're getting good oxygen depending on what activities you're participating in. An aneurysm is any time we see a weakening in the blood vessel wall, in an artery wall, and if that weakening continues and under higher blood pressure, that vessel wall can burst. So we see aneurysms in the brain, and we also see them in the major artery that runs down the abdominal region, which is called the abdominal aorta. So you might hear people talk about a triple A, and a triple A is when the abdominal aorta bursts, and because that's such a large vessel, a person can lose a lot of blood very quickly, and the chances of survival from an abdominal aortic aneurysm are very low. Here is an example of an aneurysm serving the brain. We can see this large vessel here and how it's stretched out, and eventually that wall would become so thin that it'll burst. And again, a lot of blood loss. People that have a aneurysm in the brain, again, chance of survival much lower compared to a stroke that's caused by a clot. So the branches of the arteries we call arterioles, and these are the ones that really control our blood pressure on a minute-to-minute basis. So they are reflexively controlled depending on the needs of the body, and they're going to either increase blood flow to our capillaries to feed our tissues or decrease blood flow depending if they're vasoconstricting or vasodilating. And again, the capillaries are sites of exchange between our blood and our body cells. They have a very thin wall, just 1 cell thick, and we have many, many, many capillaries that feed our organs, our tissues, so there's a huge surface area for exchange. And we find that if, for example, a person who exercises and say participates in weightlifting or long distance running, sprinting, all of those activities, that over time those tissues will actually grow more capillaries to serve the needs of that hard working tissue. So for example, an older person that maybe has a little bit of plaque buildup in their arteries will actually have more capillaries serving their heart muscle, because over time the heart muscle's needs for oxygen have encouraged more capillary growth. And that's why an older person can survive a mild heart attack better than a younger person, because an older person just has more blood supply to that heart. So here's a view of capillaries, and if you look at this slide here of capillary blood flow, you can see that those capillaries are so thin, so narrow, that blood cells, red blood cells, go through one at a time. They go through single file through those capillaries to feed our tissues. And because of that, if we get a clot feeding a capillary, or an arterial, or even an artery, depending on the size of the clot, that just shuts down blood flow to that tissue. So we can see that we have all these nutrients and oxygen coming into the capillary bed, and then that feeds the tissue cells, and at the same time those tissue cells are releasing carbon dioxide and waste to the capillary bed, and again this will branch into venules and eventually veins, bringing that blood back to the heart to be filtered and by the kidneys and recirculated again to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So here is this network of capillaries we see. So we have freshly oxygenated blood full of nutrients from the digestive system, and then there's these special capillary sphincters that control blood flow through the capillary, so depending on the needs of the body. For example, if the sympathetic nervous system is dominating, we would see a reduced blood flow to the digestive tract. So the capillaries serving the digestive tract would, we would see contracted capillary sphincters to prevent a lot of blood flow to the digestive tract, so that blood can be redirected to the heart, the lungs, and the muscles to participate in fight or flight. And the opposite would be true if you're in the parasympathetic state, which we call the rest and digest. In that case, we would see relaxed precapillary sphincters with increased blood supply to the digestive tract to promote digestion. So if we look at the speed of blood flow through the blood vessels, we can see we have this kind of up and down blood flow in the arteries because of the pressure waves. We have relaxation and constriction occurring, these pressure waves due to the heart forcing the blood and changing pressure in the arteries. But when we get into the capillaries, we see that things speed up but then slow down at the same time, because we want to ensure good blood flow. We want to slow this blood down so we have good exchange occurring with the tissues. And then again, after it enters the veins, the speed picks up and it carries that blood back to the heart. So again, veins are carrying blood back to the heart. They have the same number of layers as arteries, but the inner lumen is much larger, and we call these the reservoirs for blood volume because they hold a lot of blood due to that larger lumen. But the blood flow back to the heart, it does not rely on muscles as much as it does on contracting our skeletal muscles. When you take a deep breath, that changes the pressure in your abdominal cavity and your thoracic cavity, and that encourages blood flow upward to the heart. And also we have these valves that prevent backflow. So because of these three differences in how blood flows back to the heart from the veins, it's really important that people walk after surgery and that they get up and use those skeletal muscles to encourage blood flow back to the heart. And also it's important that we have our patients practice deep breathing. Again, that's going to help bring that blood flow back to the heart. And sometimes people have leaky valves in their veins, which we call varicose veins, and you can see the bulging of the vein as extra blood remains in those veins and does not go back to the heart. So that's why we wrap people with ACE wraps. Sometimes they'll wear TED hose. Those are all, supports that we have to help people return blood back to the heart. But again, we can't underemphasize the importance of activity in getting people up, walking around to get that blood flow and preventing clots in their veins, because that can be very serious and prevent blood flow back to the heart, and it remains in the tissue, and that can do damage to those organs or tissues or even limbs that are experiencing a blood clot. So it's really important we keep our patients moving and ourselves when we're ill to prevent blood clots and keep the blood flowing back to the heart. So here we can see how this vein is being constricted as the muscle contracts, and that is going to encourage blood flow. Now when that happens too, we can see how this valve is closed so the blood doesn't go back down the vein. It's always encouraged to move upward. So again, very important to keep ourselves moving. So that'll finish this part of our discussion on the cardiovascular system, looking at the vascular. Our next video will talk about the heart and its structure and function.